Popular movies can be cultural milestones, but some movies are more like speed bumps. In some of the worst cases, movies get hyped up as the next big thing, and then they never even get released.
The Dark Universe will probably go down in Hollywood history as a prime example of the high risk a studio runs of being embarrassed by overhyped films. In an attempt to mirror the Marvel Cinematic Universe's interwoven narratives and massive box office success, Universal Studios looked to their own crossover-worthy characters, classic monsters like Dracula, the Wolfman, and more. While it wouldn't be the first time Universal had made crossover movies, the ideas behind this new franchise seem to borrow more from superhero and action movies than the gothic influences of their early 1900s forebears. Universal even invested in a special Dark Universe logo to introduce films that would take place in the universe. So,
what happened?
Unfortunately, despite all-star casting like Tom Cruise in The Mummy and Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man, the Dark Universe was quickly derailed when The Mummy bombed at the box office. Bride of Frankenstein, which was rumored to star Angelina Jolie in the title role, was quickly taken off of Universal's schedule, and despite a massive launch announcement with a Photoshop lineup of the stars, the creatives behind the would-be franchise moved on to other projects. It looks like the real Dark Universe was ours all along. The Divergent adaptations seemed like a sure thing. Based on the hit young adult novels by Veronica Roth, the dystopian action series seemed like the natural heir to the Hunger Games hysteria that dominated the box office. Unfortunately, while the first two films managed to earn a respectable return on investment, they weren't quite as bankable as the studio might have hoped. Even so, Lionsgate went forward with splitting the final film into two, like Harry Potter, Twilight, and The Hunger Games before it, and that decision turned out to be a huge mistake. Allegiant was only loosely based on the book version of the same, and not only were the reviews for the film scathing, but fans failed to turn up at the ticket booth as well. As a result, the would-be final film, Ascendant, fell apart at the seams by losing its director and cast, and then being shunted off to the television circuit, where it's remained in production limbo. Based on the gripping bestseller by Max Brooks, World War Z came loaded with a passionate fan base, including some of Hollywood's most prestigious actors. After a bidding war against Leonardo DiCaprio's production group Appian Way, Brad Pitt's company Plan B optioned and produced the film adaptation of the apocalyptic zombie thriller. Unfortunately, things started going downhill from there as the film became an entirely different kind of disaster movie. After the initial filming process was complete, the flick went through a massive reshoot process that basically replaced the film's entire third act and made it unrecognizable to readers of Brooks's version. Although it still went on to score a solid $500 million at the box office, the film's ballooned production costs ate into those profits. A sequel was still announced by Paramount Pictures due to the bounty of book material left to bring to the big screen.
We have so many ideas and so much information that we think we got a lot of stuff to mine from, yeah.
However, the film's release date has continued to be bumped back again and again to the point where it seems like director David Fincher might never get a chance to resurrect this franchise. The first Terminator Genisys left a lot to be desired. For instance, the movie was straight up incomplete and basically relied on the eventual sequel to complete the narrative. Unfortunately, planning for a sequel can backfire if the released movie underperforms, and that's exactly what happened with Genisys. The film did have some serious star power with Emilia Clarke and the return of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who made good on that promise.
I'll be back.
However, the movie underperformed in the US and fell short of its production budget by about $60 million. What was meant to be the birth of a new trilogy turned out to be a non-starter, and the second installment was removed from Paramount's upcoming releases, paving the way for yet another adjustment of franchise continuity with the sequel that would ignore everything after Judgment Day. Sony didn't just own the rights to Spider-Man, the studio also laid claim to an assortment of other characters related to everybody's favorite friendly neighborhood web-slinger. In order to compete with Marvel's growing domination of the superhero genre, Sony announced plans in 2014 to make a Sinister Six movie, to be directed by Drew Goddard. The film's conceit was fairly ambitious, bringing together 6 of Spidey's most famous villains together as the titular supervillain team. Promotional materials were even created to build fan fervor following the release of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Sadly, while everyone seemed invested in making Sinister Six a reality, The Amazing Spider sequel underperformed, paving the way for a deal between Marvel and Sony that was struck just in time to reboot the character again with Tom Holland in the role, and have Spidey make his Marvel Cinematic Universe debut alongside Captain America and Iron Man in Captain America Civil War. It led to all sorts of Spider-Man goodness, but the collateral damage of the deal included Goddard's Sinister Six.
The 21st century superhero film craze began in earnest in 2002 with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, which starred Tobey Maguire as the masked, web-spinning crime fighter. When Raimi's first Spider venture raked in an American box office take of $403 million, Spider-Man 2 became pretty much inevitable. That movie did just as well when it was released in 2004 too, and so Sony naturally followed it up with 2007 Spider-Man 3, a movie best known for this.
How's the pie?
So good.
Despite attracting so-so reviews, the third movie still earned more money than both its predecessors, meaning Sony was more than justified in greenlighting Spider-Man 4 and Spider-Man 5. Veteran actors John Malkovich and Anne Hathaway were both attached to the franchise and were to appear as villain Vulture and love interest Felicia Hardy, respectively. And the crew was supposed to start filming the fourth movie in early 2010. But in January 2010, just before cameras were set to roll, Deadline reported that Raimi had walked away from the franchise, having reportedly insisted that a year wasn't enough time to make a good enough movie. Rather than looking for a replacement, Sony canceled Spider-Man 4 altogether, opting instead to reboot the series with a new cast and crew. The Superman film franchise lay dormant for years after the thundering flop that was 1987's Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. That movie earned a genuinely insulting $15 million at the box office, which was just less than its already modest $17 million budget. But in 1996, after Tim Burton's Batman movies had reinvigorated the superhero movie genre, Warner Brothers' John Peters brought in filmmaker Kevin Smith to carry on Superman's story. Smith was supposed to rewrite a screenplay then titled Superman Reborn, which was subsequently renamed Superman Lives. But Peters had some bizarre demands for Smith. For example, Superman wasn't allowed to fly in the movie, and he also had to wear an all-black suit. There were also a number of polar bear bodyguards involved for some reason, and at one point, Supes had to fight a giant mechanical spider. Smith somehow incorporated all these requirements into his script and even recommended that his frequent collaborator, Ben Affleck, play Superman. Tim Burton was hired to direct, however, and he brought in his own choice to wear the cape, Nicolas Cage. Months of rewrites, delays, studio maneuvering, and budgetary issues ensued, with Superman Lives finally kicking the bucket when Burton stepped down to film Sleepy Hollow instead. The franchise was thrown back into limbo, and Kal-El wouldn't reappear on the silver screen until the release of Superman Returns in 2006. Fox churned out a couple of Fantastic Four movies back in the 2000s, the appropriately named The Fantastic Four and its follow-up, Rise of the Silver Surfer. Since that second film made significantly less money than the first, Fox didn't go for the full trilogy, but the studio certainly wasn't done with the characters. The studio hired Green Lantern co-writer Michael Green to pen a reboot, but 3 years later, the movie was still stuck in development hell. So Fox brought in Jeremy Slater to write and hired Josh Trank to direct. But shooting on Fantastic Four was a straight-up disaster, with Trank alleging multiple instances of executive meddling. He later told Polygon that his creative input was often ignored and that Fox brought in new writers for reshoots, which the studio had allegedly planned from the outset. Scenes that Trank wanted to film wound up cut from the script, while other fully completed scenes were left out of the movie's theatrical cut. The summer 2015 release, Fantastic Four, didn't exactly please the fans, earning just $56.1 million in North America and amassing an atrocious 9% on Rotten Tomatoes.
It's fantastic.
Say that again?
In the wake of that cinematic debacle, Fox removed their planned Fantastic Four sequel from its 2017 release schedule. And now that Marvel Studios are producing their own Fantastic Four movie, you can probably safely bet that this particular version of Marvel's first family is dead and buried. Superhero team-up movies are commonplace nowadays, what with Marvel's hugely successful Avengers movies and DC Comics' slightly less successful Justice League. But that whole phenomenon might have begun far earlier if Warner Brothers had seen Justice League Mortal to its completion. Production on this superstar superhero movie began in 2007, with a target release date of 2009. George Miller, the filmmaker behind Mad Max Fury Road, agreed to direct, sets were built, and a cast was hired and fitted for costumes. Armie Hammer was to star as Batman, DJ Catrono was going to play Superman, Megan Gale would be Wonder Woman, Common came on as Green Lantern, and Adam Brody was cast as The Flash. Warner Brothers earmarked an astounding $200 million for Justice League Mortal, which would have ranked it among the most costly films of all time. Unfortunately, the script still needed a good amount of work, and any potential rewrites were delayed by the Writers Guild of America strike in 2007 and 2008. By the time that had been resolved, most of the cast members' contracts had expired, and they'd long moved on to other projects. Movie audiences were introduced to the X-Force in 2018's Deadpool 2, in which the iconic Super Squad was personally assembled by the Merc with the Mouth himself. Unfortunately, it doesn't end well.
Oh, yeah. That's right, Madlam.
The X-Force has been around in the comics in various forms since the early 90s, conceived as a spin-off of the X-Men. Suitably, plans for a now abandoned X-Force trilogy were set in motion long before the Deadpool films were released. In 2013, Fox hired Kick-Ass 2 filmmaker Jeff Wadlow to write and direct an X-Force movie. He later teased the project's premise to Comic Book Movie, saying, "If X-Men was about mutants who get to go to private school with Wolverine and Professor X, what about the mutants that have to go to public school? What about the ones who don't have the benefactor looking out for them?" Wadlow apparently developed a story that would unfold over 3 movies, following a band of kids who eventually form a hit squad and Black Ops team. Now that Disney has acquired Fox, however, it seems the chances of an X-Force movie happening anytime soon have flown straight into the wood chipper. After the X-Men and the Avengers, it seemed like the next big thing in the world of Marvel was destined to be the Inhumans. The studio whetted the public's appetite for the lesser-known team of X-Men-like individuals, first by introducing them to the MCU on ABC's popular series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then by announcing plans to spin them off into their own movie. At a Marvel media event in 2014, studio boss Kevin Feige said that Inhumans would mark the 20th MCU entry, comprising a huge part of the studio's Phase 3 slate of films. It was due to hit theaters on November 2nd, 2018. Then it was suddenly delayed until summer 2019, and then Marvel delayed the project indefinitely. The reason? Well, when Marvel made a deal with Sony to include Peter Parker in the MCU, the studio pivoted its attention towards their burgeoning Spider-Man franchise. Considering the Inhumans were second tier at best compared to Spidey, the project was quickly shelved in his place, and eventually turned into a widely panned and quickly cancelled ABC television series. At the same time that a Hulk-inspired contracting frenzy led Marvel to ink their deal with Universal, the two entertainment behemoths announced another movie based on Prime, a relatively obscure comic book character dating back to the early 1990s. Avi Arad announced at the time, "Prime is a complete departure from the standard superhero story. With this film, we are developing what we think will be Marvel's first superhero action comedy." Marvel big shots Kevin Feige and Stan Lee were cited as executive producers, while Arad was set to actively produce the film. It was supposed to tell an extremely Shazam-like tale of a teenager who, as the result of a government experiment, could instantly turn into an adult, who's also a superhero. Screenwriting duo Don Calumet and Chris Conroy were responsible for the script, even though they had just one feature film credit between them, the 2001 Disney Channel original movie Hounded. Seeing as how no progress has been made on this film in nearly 2 decades, it's probably fair to say that the time for Prime has passed. In late 2018, Deadline reported that Fox had hired Julius Avery, director of the horror movie Overlord, to helm a new, big-budget film version of Flash Gordon. A popular comic strip in the early 20th century, it centered on the exploits of muscular American athlete Flash Gordon, who heads into space to fight the evil Ming the Merciless. The last time it appeared on the big screen was as a campy low-budget movie in 1980, starring Sam J. Jones as Flash and featuring an iconic soundtrack by Queen.
Gordon's alive!
After Kingsman filmmaker Matthew Vaughn opted to produce but not direct the movie, Fox accepted a story pitch from Avery, who is a lifelong fan of the Flash Gordon comic strip. That version of the movie ultimately fell apart, but shortly after Disney acquired Fox in 2019, Thor Ragnarok director Taika Waititi was announced as the new director of the long-gestating Flash Gordon revival, which had apparently been reworked as an animated feature. Not more than a few weeks later, however, Flash Gordon appeared on a long list of projects in various states of pre-production that Disney had inherited from Fox, and which the Mouse House had summarily cancelled. Ming isn't the only merciless one, it would seem. For decades now, Sony has controlled all of Spider-Man's many villains and supporting characters, and a few years ago, the studio decided to tell their stories as part of a shared universe. Now officially titled the Sony Pictures Universe of Marvel's Characters, this wide-ranging franchise includes every Spider-Verse movie that isn't specifically centered on Spider-Man, such as the Tom Hardy vehicle Venom and its sequel, as well as Morbius starring Jared Leto as the titular living vampire. Sony also planned a team-up movie featuring two other Spider-Man characters, the mercenary Silver Sable and the ace cat burglar Black Cat. In May 2017, Sony tapped Gina Prince-Bythewood to direct Silver and Black, with plans for a theatrical release date of February 2019. That all changed in June 2018, however, when Sony took the movie off of its schedule. There were apparently internal problems with the production, specifically that Prince-Bythewood reportedly didn't much care for the shooting script she'd been given. Continuous delays over the script meant that meeting a theatrical release 8 months later would have been next to impossible. However, it wasn't long after scrapping Silver and Black that Sony decided it would instead pursue separate movies for the two characters, both of which are currently in development. For now. James Franco is an artist with many passions, from writing to directing to painting, and he isn't above showing up in the odd superhero movie either. Early in his acting career, he played Harry Osborn in Sam Raimi's 2000s Spider-Man trilogy. Not only that, he also nearly became one of the few actors to play more than one comic book character in different franchises, having been attached to star as the mutant Multiple Man in a standalone film for Fox. In 2017, Deadline reported that the man of multiple talents would produce and star in a film about the mutant James Madrox, who is able to create clones of himself at will. Franco told The Hollywood Reporter in 2017 that he wanted to make a different, edgier comic book movie akin to Deadpool or Logan. He said, "Our bottom line MO is, how can we push this into new ground? We're going to take this superhero thing and push it into a new genre." X-Men franchise overseer Simon Kinberg was also actively involved in the project, and nearly a year after its announcement, he told IGN that a script was currently being worked on. That, of course, was in 2018, and with Disney having acquired Fox soon after, it's definitely not looking good for Multiple Man. There are three things that almost everyone can agree are fantastic: cowboys, ninjas, and Vikings. Most filmgoers are also of the consensus that Chris Pratt is awesome, as the likable actor has headlined blockbusters as disparate as Jurassic World, Guardians of the Galaxy, and the Lego Movie. Hollywood producers searching for a surefire hit didn't have to think too hard then to combine Cowboys, Ninjas, Vikings, and Chris Pratt via the movie Cowboy Ninja Viking. Based on the graphic novel of the same name by A.J. Lieberman and Riley Rossmo, the film was to depict the mind-blowing adventures of Dr. Sebastian Gillane, a psychotherapist who can transform into three different secret agent personas: a cowboy, a ninja, and a Viking. Pratt signed on to star as Dr. Gillane, with Priyanka Chopra featuring in a supporting role. Game of Thrones director Michelle MacLaren would make her feature film debut with a $65 million budget to play with. This fun action comedy was scheduled to hit movie theaters on June 28, 2019, but just a week after Chopra's involvement was announced, Universal pulled the movie from its schedule and ended production, delaying the film indefinitely. According to an insider, the film had a number of script issues still to work out. Its problems were apparently so bad, in fact, that rumors Universal would cancel the movie had floated around for nearly half a year before the studio finally called it a day.